Welcome to Session 3 of this faith group study, Ripped from the Headlines, the Chaos of Judges and the Chaos of Today. In this study, we've been reading accounts from a chaotic time in Israel's history as background to what seems like a chaotic time in our day, both in our nation and in the world. These ancient accounts can sound as if they were ripped from today's headlines, but they are historical records of real events from a very troubled time in the history of Israel. One feature of the chaos that is afflicting many people today is a collapse of confidence in all sorts of institutions. Now we can have a separate discussion on whether that's warranted or not, but poll after poll reveals that many Americans have lost trust in government, in the media, in academia, other organizations, and that includes the church as well. Experts of all kinds have taken a serious hit to their credibility. And one part of that loss of confidence has been a concern for leadership. You may have read about a lieutenant colonel in the Marines who sacrificed his position and his pension to call out his superiors for their lack of leadership during the withdrawal from Afghanistan. But that's just one anecdote. I've read several thoughtful articles that suggest that today's societal leaders simply pale in comparison in terms of their integrity and their convictions and their leadership compared to those of the past. Well, of course, that in turn only fuels further loss of confidence and a sense of chaos in the world. Well, that troubling trend in particular makes today's judge a perfect subject to consider. The headline ripped from the news for this account is, "Where there's a wool, there's a way. 300 troops lead to surprise rout." Now that may be enough to tip you off that we're studying Gideon today. His story may be more familiar than Ehud's or Deborah's that we've already looked at. Parts of Gideon's story have captivated people's imagination through the years. Plus, of course, the Gideon's organization and ministry have kept his name alive. But his story also has elements that you may not know or be quite as familiar with. It's a longer text, so we'll just try to hit highlights. And again, encourage you to read the whole story later. But one note before we start. As you read through this text, Gideon goes by two different names. Besides Gideon, he's also called Jerubbaal. We don't really know which name was original or why there are two names. However, since Jerubbaal contains the name of the chief idol that the Israelites worshipped, Baal, it's possible that the author of Judges saw Gideon as just a more respectable name for him. Well, Gideon's account starts in Judges chapter 6, and it starts out in a very familiar way, following this four-step pattern that runs all the way through Judges. Israel again turned from the Lord and chased after the idols of foreign nations. Now, it's very possible that the Israelites believed or were convinced that they had to worship these gods because they controlled the agricultural cycle. It was the only way they were going to have food to eat and to survive. But that's no excuse. I mean, as Israelites, they confessed that God is the creator of heaven and earth. God had provided manna and quail and water for them through the 40 years of wandering through the wilderness. God had brought them into the promised land. to think that some other god now controlled nature in that place was a huge betrayal of God. And so, the second step of the pattern, God gave them over to their enemies. In this case, the Midianites. Now, Midian was another nation or tribe to the east and the south of Israel. At one time, the Midianites had been allies of Israel. If you go back to Exodus, Moses' first wife, Zipporah, was a Midianite. But once Israel became a nation, Midian became one of their many enemies. Now, if you look at verse 3 through 6 in Judges 6, Midian didn't just take taxes or tribute from the people, but they were taking all the fruit of the land. Like a scorched earth policy, they were just hoovering up everything from the people. And so Israel was not just oppressed, but greatly impoverished. In fact, if you look at verse 2 of chapter 6, they lived in caves and holes like refugees. And after 7 years of that, they cried out to the Lord for help. And he responded by calling Gideon. And God could not possibly have chosen a more unlikely candidate. We meet Gideon in Judges 6, verse 11, where he is beating out his wheat in a wine press. That language may not bring any pictures to mind. But in the ancient world, wheat was usually threshed on a big open threshing floor by throwing it up in the wind. And the chaff would blow off and the heavier grain would drop. Gideon, on the other hand, is hiding in a hole and just beating out his grain so that the Midianites won't see him and come and take his crop. Now, of course, that's one sign of how oppressive the Midianites were, but it's also not what you'd call a profile in courage. Gideon is hiding out in fear. And so it's more than a bit ironic when the angel of the Lord comes to him and addresses him as a mighty warrior. Really? Where? I mean, there's scarce evidence of Gideon being any kind of a mighty warrior. First off, in verse 13, he expresses deep doubts and despair about God being with his people or doing anything to rescue them. Then in verse 15, he has a whole raft of excuses to evade God's call to lead the people. He's too weak, his clan is too small, he's not the guy, he doesn't want the job. And then even after God reassures him, in verse 16, he wants proof. Sort of wonder if Gideon came from Missouri, the show-me state. But actually, in the Bible, God frequently calls those who seem least likely to serve in really important roles. And Gideon certainly fits that pattern. But it also reminds us as readers that only God can deliver Israel. Even as he raises up judges to be the instruments of his will, the judges don't deliver the people. God does that. Well, in the next section, Gideon asks the angel to accept some hospitality from him, which was a driving obligation in that part of the world. Even to this day, it is. But we soon find out in verses 17 and 18 that what Gideon is really after is a sign. Some kind of proof of God's call to him. He still has no real confidence in God's word or his promise to be with him. And surprisingly, perhaps, the angel gives him exactly what he wants. You maybe know by the time we get to the Gospels, Jesus refuses to give signs when he's asked. But the angel gives Gideon exactly what he asks for. When Gideon brings out his meal, the angel burns it with fire and then disappears. And that was actually a little more than what Gideon bargained for. If you look in verse 22, only now does he actually perceive that this visitor was an angel of the Lord. And his response is sheer terror. That too was a common response to God's appearances in the Old Testament. But it suggests that Gideon hasn't really heard the promises or the assurances that the angel has given him. But once more, the angel speaks a word of comfort in verse 23. And that also is typical for God or for his angels when they appear to people. They bring a word of comfort and peace. Do not be afraid. But that doesn't mean that there never was any danger for Gideon. I mean, in a sense, he was right. God's holy presence should simply consume sinners. But God won't let it happen. And here that's due both to God's mercy, but also his determination to use Gideon for his mission to rescue the people of Israel. Well, again, this whole opening section just suggests very strongly that God is in charge of this whole process, not Gideon. Well, after these signs and these promises, Gideon finally found some courage. And he obeyed a command from God to destroy an altar to Baal that belonged to his father. So there's idolatry right in Gideon's own household. But if you know in verse 27, even now Gideon is too afraid just to confront anyone. So he pulls down the altar at night under the cover of darkness. And so at this point, as the Midianites are threatening again, God intervenes directly. And he captures Gideon with his spirit, inspires him directly to become more of a leader. And you see that Gideon raised an army, but the soldiers came from just 4 tribes of Israel: Manasseh, Asher, Naphtali, and Zebulun. As we've seen before with the earlier judges, only some tribes were involved with each one. Israel was not a united nation yet at this point. But even still, with God's direct inspiration, with the raising of an army, Gideon still isn't sure of himself or of his leadership ability. And so in Judges 6, starting at verse 36, we find one of the best known parts of Gideon's story. He asks for not just one, but 2 more signs from God to reassure him. He takes a fleece of wool, puts it on the ground, and says, "Lord, let the fleece be wet and the ground around it be dry in the morning." God patiently says, "Sure." And that's what Gideon finds in the morning. The fleece is soaked. He can fill a whole bowl of water by squeezing it out, but the ground around it is dry. That's pretty impressive. It might convince most people, but not Gideon. He wants to run the test again in reverse. In the morning, Lord, now let the wool be dry and the ground around it be wet. But that's actually more than a simple reversal. Wool is very, very absorbent. It just soaks up water. And so for a fleece to remain dry on wet ground is kind of miraculous. Hugely unexpected. And yet God steps in and does exactly what Gideon asks. So we see here that Gideon, this man that God is determined to raise up as a judge, was anything but a strong, courageous, confident leader. And yet God was simply insistent that he was the one that would lead the people of Israel to victory over the Midianites. And I think for anyone among us who is afraid or uncertain about leading. This is really encouraging. But it also takes away our excuses as well, as we see God working so patiently with Gideon and shepherding him along. But then, just as that becomes clear, God turns the tables on Gideon. Just as he finally accepted this role, this mission that God had given him. As we move into Judges 7, we find God telling Gideon that the army he raised was much too large. What? Who's ever heard of an army being too big? That's what you want, isn't it? But God insisted that Gideon pare down the army. And it turned out it wasn't much of an army to start with. At the first invitation, 2/3 of them hightail it back home. They really weren't interested in fighting. Meanwhile, though, the Midianite army is described as being countless, like the grains of sand on the seashore. But remarkably, God still wasn't done. He then told Gideon that even 10,000 soldiers was way too many. And so in Judges 7, verses 4 to 8, God winnowed the army down further with a rather odd-sounding test. He said, Gideon, take your soldiers down to the river and watch how they drink. Soldiers who use their hands to cup water to their mouth, they go home. But soldiers who lean down and lap up the water like a dog, they get to stay. So what? God wanted soldiers with bad manners? Well, there's actually no explanation in the text. I mean, God simply chooses those that he wants. But it's at least possible that the distinction is that those who lapped the water never laid down their weapons. So at a moment's notice, they'd be ready to fight. It might suggest that they just had more of a soldier's instinct than those who laid down a sword or a spear in order to take a drink of water. In any case, God left Gideon with a measly 300 troops against this massive Midianite army. It seems like a suicide mission. Why cut the force down so far? Make it so small? Well, if you back up to verse 2 in chapter 7, God himself gave the explanation. By making the army so small, God left no explanation for their victory other than divine intervention. And it's because he knew that in their pride they would take credit if they thought in any way it was due to their own strength. And so the small army guards against any sense of human credit for what is about to happen. And yet, having put Gideon on that spot, God still shepherds him along in this leadership role. Well, knowing that Gideon is still not confident in his leadership, he's still afraid to go after the Midianites, God sends him down to the Midianite camp. And there he experiences a very unusual kind of prophecy. Most often in a situation like this, God would send a prophet with a message to the king or the general of the army. But in chapter 7, verse 14, Gideon hears the prophecy from a couple of Midianite soldiers. God sent one a dream, and the other interprets it as being a sign of Gideon's victory. Now we might ask, how would a Midianite know about Gideon or make sense out of this dream? But the author again just points to God's inspiration. God's running this show, beginning to end. And it's almost a bit comical that this Midianite soldier is way more impressed with Gideon than Gideon is. And yet even at that, the Midianite gives all the credit to God. And the point of the author comes through clearly to the reader. Well, overhearing this prophecy, Gideon's confidence is restored for the third time in the account. And so he called his 300 troops to action, but how in the world are they going to win? Well, first, in verse 19, Gideon went at night. And in a time when there were no streetlights, when it was pitch black at night, nobody fought battles at night. Up until the 20th century, battles always occurred during the day. But even coming under the cover of darkness, winning this battle would still require some subterfuge. And so in chapter 7, starting at verse 16, we run into the other best-known part of Gideon's account. He had told each of his 300 soldiers to have a trumpet and a torch that was covered by a pitcher. And Gideon used those two elements to execute a brilliant strategy. And I think it's works the best if we try to imagine it from a Midianite perspective. I mean, you're in camp, it's pitch black outside, there may be a couple of campfires, a couple of soldiers watching the perimeter, but otherwise all is quiet. And then suddenly, you see lights all around the camp as the Israelites break their pitchers and the torches burn brightly in the darkness. And then the trumpets sound all at once. And these are not like modern trumpets with a beautiful clear sound. These were the shofar. They were made from a ram's horn. And they give off the most awful, bleeding sound. It had to have just terrified these Midianites. Well, in shock, you're looking and hearing all of this. The Midianites likely assumed that each one of these torches and trumpets represent a whole company of soldiers. And they're thrown into absolute panic. In fact, it caused so much chaos that basically the Midianites fought each other in the dark, while the Israelites stood by and watched. Gideon's 300 were mostly observers rather than warriors in this battle. But that, of course, is the ultimate sign of God's deliverance, God's victory, not Gideon's. And that also points to another maybe humorous little note in the story. In verse 18, Gideon's call to his army is for the Lord and for Gideon. Well, for the Lord, yes, but who's going to fight for Gideon? But that in itself suggests that God's concern way back in verse 2 for the pride of the people getting in the way of crediting him with the victory was well-founded. Well, despite this stunning victory over this enormous Midianite army, Gideon struggled to establish his rule in Israel. Now again, as we've noted before, the Israelite tribes were far from united at this time. They were pretty independent, didn't easily come under anyone's rule. But you have to wonder if the people didn't also recognize Gideon's many weaknesses and that they didn't have all the confidence in the world in him. There were some people who wanted to make Gideon a king, but he faithfully refused that. That was not to be the role of the judges. God was to be king in Israel. But he did rule as a judge for 40 years, and he also managed to have 70 sons. So we kind of know what he did in his spare time. Well, Gideon's story, I think, has some important lessons for our day that sometimes seems to lack the leaders that we need. First, it shows that God makes leaders more than he finds them or identifies them. It also assures us that God works patiently but insistently to equip his people for the service he wants them to do, for the mission he has in mind. But it also declares very clearly that God does for us what we cannot do for ourselves. And often, to no one's greater surprise than our own. And finally, it's an assurance that despite our weaknesses, or our strengths for that matter, God alone will and does see to it that His will is done, just as Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. So now have some great conversation in your groups around the story of Gideon, the unlikely leader. And then we'll see you next time for session 4.